Hello and welcome to CRB Monitor's second installment of Cannabis Q&A. My name is James Francis and I'm the Chief Research Officer at CRB Monitor. CRB Monitor is a global database of more than 65,000 cannabis-related businesses, and at the heart of our database are more than 160,000 cannabis licenses and 93,000 individuals, which all help to provide essential market intelligence related to all of those businesses. As part of our focus on capturing industry trends, we launched this series of interviews with business and thought leaders within the cannabis industry. And in each interview, we cover a range of topics from the global economy to regulation and other business and macro trends shaping the cannabis industry this year. Today, I'm joined by Charlie Bachtell, founder and CEO of Cresco Labs. Now, Charlie is an attorney and brings with him deep legal expertise in both corporate governance and complex regulatory compliance. He led the expansion efforts for Cresco through merit-based applications and a successful M&A strategy, and works tirelessly to ensure that Cresco remains an industry leader, setting new standards for a progressive, transparent, and reputable cannabis community, and operating at all times in a professional, secure, and compliant manner. Charlie is a founding member of the Illinois Cannabis Bar Association and industry trade associations in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And prior to Cresco Labs, Charlie served for 8 years as the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Guaranteed Rate, the nation's 7th largest mortgage bank, a leading attorney during the reform of the US mortgage industry. He is an adjunct professor at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law, teaching a course on the legal and regulatory issues in the emerging cannabis industry. Welcome, Charlie, and thank you for joining me today. Now,
James, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Cresco Labs is covered quite extensively by CRB Monitor, and we are very interested in your company, given the leadership role that Cresco has taken in the cannabis industry. As one of the largest multi-state operators in the US, Cresco is about to get considerably larger when your acquisition of Columbia Care closes this year, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So more specifically to you, Charlie, because we're very curious. So I thought we might take a few minutes and get some insight into Charlie Bachtell. This is of particular interest here at CRB Monitor, given our largely compliance-heavy user base. So to start, can you tell us about your decision 9 years ago to transition from general counsel at a large mortgage company to the founding of a cannabis business?
Sure, and it's a question I get asked in one way or another quite often. Maybe I should say earlier on, yes. Now not as many people know about the origin story and the transition. So it's always good to be able to share that story, because I think it really does help paint the picture of who Cresco Labs is. So, my background in sort of being at the forefront of the regulatory of mortgage banking is a giant influence on the perspective that me and my co-founders were able to bring to the cannabis space. So yeah, it was, I was general counsel, executive vice president. We were enjoying sort of the scaling of that organization after really the mortgage meltdown of 2008, 9, 10, and sort of everything that came from it. And again, it's an important part of who I am and then how Cresco was built, because that's a very unique experience. There aren't many people that have found themselves really at the epicenter of a global financial crisis, and being in the mortgage banking space. At that time, that's exactly what happened. And again, practices varied from organization to organization, but at the heart of it, what was identified in that sort of Great Recession was that there wasn't enough regulatory oversight as it related to a group or a category of specific financing options, but also then securitization of those financing options for residential homes. And The one thing I tell everybody is when your industry does find itself at the epicenter of that kind of focus in a global financial collapse, just get ready for regulation to start flying your direction from every single angle. And that's really what 2008, 2009, 2010 was for us, was the ways of working would change monthly for sure. Whether it was, again, we were state chartered also. So we were state licensed organization. We were not federally chartered. So, we had different regulators in every state that we operated in. So whether the change was coming from regulations at a federal level or regulations within the states that we operated in, we had to manage that inflow, and we had to make the adjustments to the ways that we worked on the fly in a relatively a constant basis. It's a very unique environment. And I would also then dovetail it and sort of marry it with, we were incredibly successful at it. So guaranteed rate, when I started in 2007, I think we were large for Chicago. We were small regional player, and we had no real national presence. And when we saw what was happening with sort of the regulatory shakeup, we had two options. And it was either you embraced regulation, you engaged in the regulatory process, and you did regulation well as a business model, or you went out of business. There was literally nothing in between. And fortunately, by us being very nimble, very, I would say, entrepreneurial in the business at that time, we had about 200 employees total. We could shift business models, and we could really prioritize a new North Star better than larger, established, entrenched mortgage banks at the time, who had gotten very used to the prior regulatory environment and the tools that they had available to them. So we embraced regulation, we engaged in the process, we designed operational models to incorporate regulatory change into the way that we did business, and we did it well, we did it fast. And with that, we scaled, again, from a big in Chicago, but nothing really after that, to being at the time the sixth largest lender in the US. 3,500 employees. Over the next 4 years, we went from having, I believe, 5 brick and mortar offices to over 150. So we scaled an organization in that environment. Now, this is the long-winded version of the story, so I apologize. I'll be more efficient. Great. But now when people ask me, like, how does an attorney from the mortgage banking space get into cannabis? I said, well, let me tell you about this industry I was in that went from relatively unregulated to hyper-regulated overnight on a state-by-state basis, where Illinois was different than California, was different than Florida, was different than New York. And had a subject matter that had this sort of negative stigma associated with it. And how did you get customers to trust you to do business with you after the mortgage meltdown? Now, let me tell you about cannabis. Industry going from relatively unregulated to hyper-regulated overnight, state by state. New York different than Illinois, different than California, and a legacy of this negative stigma that required you to build trust in order for people to want to engage in a business transaction with you. So for all intents and purposes, I felt kind of like I'd read this book before. I kind of knew the progression that happens when regulation comes in and the pendulum swings all the way that way, to then coming back the other direction and settling somewhere reasonably in the middle. And also how to build trust with stakeholders that, for the most part, have a negative connotation, preconceived notion about who you are and how you do business. So felt very familiar, and we were able to borrow heavily from the experiences that we'd gained in successfully navigating that kind of transition in mortgage banking to what we felt was going to happen in the cannabis space.
Sounds like there's some excellent synergies there between the two industries. Thank you very much for that story. That was perfect. So let's move on to the global economy now that you've mentioned it. So world events have taken place over the last couple of years, and they've thrown what I would call a giant inflationary wet blanket over an otherwise robust global economy that we enjoyed up until a few years ago. And so when I look at Cresco Labs, by and large a consumer-facing company, with diverse operations that are generally very sensitive to economic swings. And so with that said, could you give our audience your outlook for the global macroeconomy and what impact it could have on cannabis businesses in the near term? We've seen kind of what it's done recently, but I'd be interested to hear what you think about what's going to happen in the next 6 months or so.
Sure, I'll comment on it to the extent I have the sort of the background or the expertise to do so, which is it's limited. I'm not an economist, and especially not at a global level. But the one thing I can tell you is you're right. We have a product that is a consumer product, and I think what we're seeing is when it costs $120 to fill up a gas tank, that impacts share of wallet and what a consumer is able to spend on other things that they'd like to participate in or have. I think the one thing, so I think we'll continue to see that play out, and I think we'll continue to see consumers behave in the way that consumers have been behaving, and I'll get to that a little bit more in a second. But I think we continue to see that until truly inflation gets under control and people start to feel again like they have a handle on what they're allowed to spend and comfortably spend per budget. The consumer indexes that we're seeing and confidence indexes, and do they think they'll spend more or less in the coming months? We're continuing to see a cautionary tale from that feedback. But the one thing I can tell you is I think I'll only speak for Cresco, but I think in general, as an industry, as even the analysts covering the industry, what we've seen in the Q2 results from the publicly traded companies in the US is that cannabis is showing itself to be fairly durable. It's definitely not a luxury item. You're seeing state data come in that, of course, shows softening of growth to a flattening curve. Some markets slightly down, but it's not telling the whole story, because what you're seeing is price compression. You're seeing additional competition and capacity come into certain states that had previously been supply constraint. Now they're not supply constraint because capacities come online and no new doors have opened. So you're seeing, once you sort of take that double click, and you see sort of why you're seeing it in these markets, what you're actually seeing is a fairly robust and durable industry where consumers are coming in, prices have compressed a bit. So while top line revenue and state performance might show softening, units are either flat or up. And if it was sort of discretionary option for consumers, you'd expect to see significantly more impact in units and total spend than what cannabis is showing itself to have here over the last quarter and likely in Q3 also based on state provided data.
Yeah, I think what investors are hoping to is that inflation and that they've sort of been able to stave off recession, but the inflation is largely sort of pandemic related, and even though it might take a while to kind of emerge from it, it's still can still be very hopeful for some of these industries. And cannabis too is sort of, has its presence across several different industry groups. It's not just, like an entertainment item. It's right. It borders on pharmaceuticals and agriculture. And, there's a number of different industries that it's sort of has its presence in, and that diversification could definitely benefit you going forward.
Agreed.
All right. So now moving on to regulations, because everybody likes to hear about what's happening there. So our next question is about progress toward federal legalization of cannabis. And so we've seen recent, what I would call capitulation by Democrats on a Safe Banking Plus bill, which the Senate could pass in 2022, but might face an uphill battle with House Democrats who want some other things, in their legislation. It also appears that legalization and decriminalization would likely face heavy challenges in both houses of Congress, let alone when a bill might make it to the president's desk. Still kind of an unknown there. And we're now less than 100 days, and probably quite a few less than 100 days from the midterm elections, and there's some uncertainty there. And meanwhile, at the state level, and by our count, 37 states plus DC and Puerto Rico have legalized medical cannabis, and 19 of those plus the DC and Puerto Rico have legalized recreational cannabis. And so my question to you is, what is your best guess on when federal legalization might eventually happen? And if it doesn't happen, how is Cresco positioned for that outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I could say great question, but I mean, it's the crystal ball type scenario. And what I would tell you is legalization, keying in on that word, that description in particular, I think is tough to handicap, because what we've seen in our experience, and again, this goes even back to sort of my experience prior to cannabis, is when there is something that, when the subject matter creates concern, when there's sort of preconceived notions about it, when it goes from something that had previously been seen as harmful, but now is showing that there's actually a way to do it that could help manage that sort of preconceived notion of what it is or what it could be. Mm-hmm. High likelihood that change happens incrementally.
Right.
I just think it's a big ask to expect total transformation in a bipartisan way that would create legalization before there's an incremental approach, testing and learning, seeing that the sky doesn't fall, and then getting more comfort as perception changes. Which again, I think just whether it's at a local level or at a state level, if you look at Illinois, Illinois never, I don't like speaking overgeneralizing, but I don't think Illinois would have ever passed an adult use law if it didn't first start with the most regulated, compliance-focused medical program that it could get through Springfield. And that's what they did in 2013. They passed the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Act. It was widely regarded as the most restricted, regulated, compliance-focused medical program in the country. It allowed the various stakeholders at the legislative level and in the administration at a regulatory level to wrap their arms around it, digest it, see how it rolled out, get comfortable with it, and then became the foundation upon which we were able to become the first state in the country to ever pass an adult use law through the legislative process, not ballot initiative, but the legislative process. If I just extrapolate that to DC, I have to imagine, I think I see a higher likelihood that that's a path that happens in DC than full legalization being the first move in something that would, I think, for all intents and purposes, need to be bipartisan supported. So full legalization, I'm not sure, but some sort of reform at a federal level, I'm optimistic that we see it before the end of the year. And that does then lay the groundwork for more progress on the issue in years and administrations to come, when they see that the sky doesn't fall, when they start to realize what an economic engine this can be, that greater access to cannabis is actually a tool for greater well-being in their citizenship. These are the things that we've seen play out in state after state after state, right, for the most part, really almost unanimously. I don't know that there's too many examples of states sort of fully regretting what they've done. They modify, they adjust, but for the most part, I think states have seen incredible success with coming up with a regulated structure that allows them to incorporate access to cannabis for their constituents. And I think that's how it'll play out at a federal level.
And here's a bit of a follow-up. And, this is because I think that for that question was something that people probably want to hear about all the time. But let's say the planets align and there's actual, legalization at the federal level, maybe just medical marijuana. How do you see a post-legalization world playing out? Let's say, are you predicting that there's going to be all kinds of increased competition, and what do you think about Cresco's strategy for that? Because I could see potential for pharmaceutical companies now coming into play if everything is legal, it's off Schedule 1, and just sort of kind of thinking out loud. Could be a couple of years in the future, but I'm very curious to hear what you might think about that scenario.
Yeah, now be careful. There's a lot to unpack in sort of how this could unfold. But I started the organization with the full belief that at some point this is federally legal, and that there's interstate commerce. And so when we put together the original business model, really it was, how do we create a normalized and professionalized cannabis industry? That's the mission of the org. It always has been. But I could tell you there were sort of three things that were kind of obvious to me when after researching this for 48 hours back in August of 13. One, that cannabis will never be less regulated than it was at the time, that there was more regulation coming. Right. Two, that all cannabis needed was to be normalized and professionalized, because you really don't have to do a demand study to wonder if this would work. It's been around for 5,000 years, right? It's even in the last 4 generations in the United States, when it's been federally illegal, it's still relatively acceptable in many, many social circles and environments, right? So you really don't have to wonder if this works. If you do it right, it'll work. So that's what the second thing that we sort of took. And then the third thing was that this was a consumer products category, whether it knew it at the time or not. This was not going to be continued to, sort of wait out in front of you where you could pick it up and smell it and put in a cellophane bag and walk out. That this was going to be regulated to the point where, from a chain of custody standpoint, from a safety standpoint, from a contamination preservation standpoint, that this was going to become another consumer packaged good. And so we built the organization, the business model, with that in mind. It wasn't built with the idea that we're going to have these protective legal moats around us with limited licenses forever and limited competition. That's why I think it's always been a point of distinction between us and our peer set, that while we feel you need to be proficient in all 4 verticals of the value chain that we identify as growing and manufacturing, brand development, distribution of brands into the wholesale market, and then owned brick and mortar retail, you need to be proficient in all 4 right now. I think that's the best way that you can compete, is being relatively balanced and capable of doing all 4. But we've always prioritized those middle 2 of building consumer brands and building the muscle that allows us to get on as many shelves as possible, because we think that's where the future of the industry grows. So as laws change or feelings change, and whether it's federal legalization, whether it's interstate commerce, whether it goes to Schedule 2, and all of that's going to create nuance. Yep. But overall, we've wanted to build the company from the very beginning to build consumer brands that establish that trusted relationship with the consumers, so it creates that stickiness like traditional CPG, and know how to get them onto as many shelves as possible, because we knew that we would never be able to own all of the shelves, that there's going to be more independent, non-vertical retail than there is vertical, owned brick and mortar.
And I think your experience, navigating through some real chaos back in 2008, 9, 10 probably prepares you for whatever happens in the next few years. So problem solving is one of our core values of our organization, like front and center. Know your audience, problem solving. Those are 2 of the things that we talk about all the time here at Cresco. If you don't like, we don't even really refer to them as problems. We refer to them as opportunities. If you don't like looking at a challenge and coming up with some elegant, creative solution to it, this is not the industry for you. Like you need to love it, because when you match highly regulated with emerging, it's problem after problem, opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Oh, that's what makes it fun. All right, and so finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the acquisition of Columbia Care. So in March of 2022, Cresco Labs announced its friendly acquisition of MSO Columbia Care in a deal worth more than $1 billion. Barring anything unforeseen, that deal is expected to close by year end. You could correct me if it's going to be sooner or a little after that. But upon the announcement of the acquisition, you said, the combination is highly complementary and provides unmatched scale, depth, diversification, and long-term growth. On a pro forma basis, The combined company will be the largest cannabis company by revenue, the #1 wholesaler of branded cannabis products, and the largest nationwide retail footprint outside of Florida. Now, Cresco's profile in our database, CRB Monitor, indicates that the combined Cresco Columbia Care entity will operate in 14 states plus the District of Columbia. Once again, you can correct me if this is not quite right, and Puerto Rico, and will control through its subsidiary businesses. We see approximately 200 cannabis licenses that are either active status or pending approval, and those licenses span pretty much the entire business, including cultivation, manufacturing, processing, transportation, retail, etc. And it's important to note that the Cresco Columbia Care acquisition is one of the only cannabis-themed M&A deals of any kind of size that we've seen in the last year. So my next question for you is in a couple of parts. So can you elaborate on your decision to make this purchase, particularly in the environment we're in? And part two is what will it take to see M&A activity pick up again for large MSOs like Cresco?
So, decision making, I think you articulated sort of the rationale, right? And that was from the release at the beginning, and that still holds true to today. I think, there's a lot of reasons why this deal made a ton of sense for us. And if you look at, and when I say us, I mean both organizations. We are complementary in the fact of, even just the way that we've built our businesses. We've had a smaller footprint. For us, real quick overview of our strategic plan from the very beginning was create the most strategic geographic footprint possible. The definition of a strategic state for us is appropriate regulations with big population that can support a robust market. Those are sort of how we evaluate any state that we want to move into. And then part two of our strategic plan is to obtain meaningful material market positions. We feel like if we focus on the states that matter, and we're relevant, not only relevant, that we're actually one of the leaders in those states, that we can piece together a footprint that creates a national set of brands and organization without being national. Can't really be national right now, right? Everything is state by state by state. So if we focus on the states that matter the most, with the biggest populations and regulations that we're comfortable with, and we execute in those states, we're effectively building a national company before it's possible to build a national company. We focused on we're critically focused on states that met those criteria. Columbia Care has been a little bit more aggressive in building a bigger footprint. So a little bit more breadth first and then focus on depth later. And if I just stop there, what you're seeing is two organizations that at the right time are coming together. We've been able to create sort of SOPs and critical mass and ways of operating that have made us very, very effective in some very large, very competitive states. And you've got Columbia Care that's built a footprint that has the states that you want to be in today and the states that you want to be in tomorrow, and haven't developed as much on the operational excellence side in depth and scale that we have. So bringing those two things together should, in theory, create a pretty great platform, combined platform for the go forward, make us very competitive. I could go on and sort of the different aspects of it, but there were probably two handfuls of things like that we really liked about the potential combination. And also when we started looking at this, which was really end of last year, beginning of this year, reading the tea leaves a little bit of, okay, well, where's growth going to come from for us? What are we looking at from a sort of a macroeconomic standpoint? What is the industry looking like as you play this out over the next 3 years? It really became evident to us that this opportunity with that footprint, with that prioritization of retail, where we were very brand and wholesale focused, but became really good retailers, like, again, the two handfuls or so of opportunities that just made a ton of sense were too much for us to ignore. And then I think it really, what we've seen at a macro level and from a sector level ever since even the announcement, let alone when we first started evaluating and putting it together, just keeps reinforcing how this combination makes a lot of sense for both shareholders and honestly for the industry as a whole. Consolidation, this sort of dovetailing into part two of your question, consolidation is what happens when emerging industry that's highly regulated develops. When you do see these independents that, you know, might not have the mass or the scale in order to become national players on their own, those then become the building blocks that create the long-term leaders in any industry. It's what we did in my prior life to create that scale and get that placement in that industry. And I think that's what you'll continue to see here. When that happens, I don't know. Again, one of the things that worked really well for us with Columbia Care is it's a Pubco and Pubco transaction.
Right.
We did an all equity deal, so it really tied our organizations together as we all sort of navigate these choppy waters of the capital markets and investor sentiment in the space. It allowed us to sort of mute any of that complexity or undulation of valuation and cash portion, and that would have been too complex to navigate. But if you can find a scenario where the companies sort of move in concert with each other, you'll see those opportunities sort of avail themselves, I think, you know, relatively soon. All the big signs and the macro pressure and the sector pressure are leading you to see scale matters. And so do growth catalysts. So you got to combine execution with growth opportunities and scale in order to be as competitive as possible in the current environment.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And you know, when you first announced, and I looked at the two companies, and so without doing sort of that deep dive into operating procedures and due diligence, I mean, I saw, you know, Columbia Care is kind of almost just a smaller version of Cresco, you know, in a lot of ways. Not, you know, you might see things a little not quite that way, but I mean, when we first looked at it, so yeah, this is really kind of a perfect fit. You know, these guys, particularly in an environment where you want to, you know, kind of hunker down, be defensive, and you know, I think it actually made perfect sense. So well done.
Hey, look, we did a great job. The team did a great job of identifying and then pursuing it. And then you have to have some good fortune too. And I think for us, what we saw was not only did the macro sort of pressures just reinforce the benefit of scale and what we were going to pull off, but the combined footprint working together the way that it did, and the divestitures, which is a big part of making this successful,
right,
just happened to be in the right states with not a ton of overlap of size. Where we're big, they were small. Where they were big, we were small. So yeah, it was good fortune sprinkled on top, for sure.
Definitely. All right. So and finally, just to wrap up. You know, CRB Monitor's research team follows the cannabis news cycle as we update our subscribers with the latest regulatory filings and press releases and exchange announcements. And so to close things out, and given the industry's uncertainty, particularly with, you know, the regulatory environment and illicit market cannabis, which we know hasn't really gone away, and, you know, what we've talked about related to the global economy, what good news can you offer Cresco's current and future shareholders?
Look, I honestly, I think that the future has never looked brighter, right? If you take that, you got to be able to take the step back, and we challenge ourselves to do this at the leadership level here at Cresco, is you know, when relevant and when appropriate. But you can't get too focused on the quarter to quarter results of this. Take that step back. This is an obvious next major consumer products category in the United States. The toothpaste is out of the tube. The genie is out of the bottle. There's 450,000 people that are currently employed in this industry across the country. I think there are $3.7 billion in state tax revenue that was derived just last year from the sale of adult use. You've got the Senate Majority Leader filing a bill on cannabis legalization and having committee hearings for the first time ever, right? So I mean, just like at the macroest of macro levels, this is an obvious industry that is developing. You see the durability of it as we're being challenged by this 40-year high watermark in inflation, where people are still showing up, and more people than previously, even if prices are down a little bit, and that makes the top line not quite as attractive as it used to be this moment in time. The fact that more people are showing up than they did last year is a great indicator of the durability of it. Sure. The fact that you've got some operators in the US that are able to kind of hold share or grow share in this environment and hold margins where margins need to be. So you're seeing some resilient operators that are showing the sort of ability to navigate the choppy waters. Like you mix all this together with the full knowledge that the ultimate catalyst, this ultimate unlock of having access to the US capital markets is closer than it's ever been and still isn't here yet, I think presents this as an incredible opportunity. That's how we look at it. And I tell you, we couldn't be more excited for where we're at right now, how we're performing as an organization, how the sector is performing in the face of all these macro pressures and what's going on in DC. For us, this is all lining up to be, a very good 23 and beyond.
That's great. And we follow 65,000 businesses, so it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon.
Right.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for today. And I'd like to thank our guest, Charlie Bachtell, the CEO of Cresco Labs, for joining us. And I wish you, Charlie, and your newly combined entity only success in the future.
Thank you, James.
Thank you so much. And for our viewers out there, stay tuned for our next interview in our series of Q&As with leaders in the cannabis industry. And for the ultimate in cannabis market intelligence, be sure to check out crbmonitor.com. And have a great day, everyone.